Fortunate to welcome once again Reverend Dr. Daniel O'Connor. He comes down about once a month to preach with us. He's a UU minister with over 20 years experience and has served congregations in Danbury, Connecticut, St. Louis, Missouri, and here in Houston. He has held leadership roles on regional and national boards. Notably, he performed the Midwest's first public gay wedding in 2003. He co-founded the UU Voice for Justice and successfully merged 3 Houston churches into a unified congregation with 3 locations. Please welcome Reverend O'Connell.
Now, if the phone that's on the pulpit goes off, it's not mine. Just to let you know, it has been there forever. Oh, I need my order, sir. I will say this is by far the most candles I've seen up here. There is a lot of joy and there's a lot to be concerned about, clearly. So it's really wonderful that this congregation exists, where you can bring your joys, your concerns, your sorrows, all of it, all of who you are. So I grew up UU, as you probably know, and I got asked, Unitarianism, what's that? And, when you're 7, you don't really have good answers to that. But on the back of the Sunday Bulletin Order of Service, you're going to see the 6 sources. And I think the order is intentional. So we start out with our own experience. Something happens to us or around us or near us that we would consider a religious experience. Maybe we get a new baby brother or a sister or something like that happens. And so we have this direct experience. And then the second source is, well, how do we make sense of that experience? Well, we can look to words and deeds of prophetic people. Okay. And then we expand and we look at world religions. How have other people in other times and other religions looked at these same things, the cycles of birth and life and death? And then because Unitarianism and Universalism come from Christianity, which came from Judaism, we look specifically at those sources. And then finally, the 5th source, which we're going to touch on today, is humanist teachings. Now, next week, I'll also be here, and we'll be talking about spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. So it's important to note that even though there are 6 sources, some people will stop at a particular source, and they'll say, that's it. So particularly in New England, for example, there are UU Christians, and they understand Christianity through a Unitarian Universalist view. But they're Christians. The kind of Christian they are is Unitarian Universalist. So they don't really necessarily go all the way through, and neither do you. So just that's kind of a context. And I grew up Unitarian Universalist, and I'm guessing maybe 10, 15% at most of people who are in our congregations grew up that way, which means really we're a denomination of immigrants, which kind of makes it tough for people to teach children who didn't grow up UU what UU is all about. So my first realization, the way this really hit me, was when I was in 2nd grade. And the teacher stepped out of the room for just a couple of minutes. The principal wanted to talk to her in the hall about something. And then Mrs. Kraut, who was a pretty strict teacher, so we were pretty quiet for like the first, 45 seconds or so while she's out in the hallway with the principal. And for some reason, these 2 kids got into a discussion about their church's creed and which one was better. I mean, out of all the things that 2nd graders could talk about, I don't know why that came up. I'm sure it was a Monday morning. And as I recall, the 2 creeds these 2 kids were talking about differed by only a couple of words. And both of them were trying to convince the rest of the class as to the superiority of their view. Kind of like people do with sports teams. Both kids were loud, and most of the other kids were paying attention to them. And then one kid said something about all of us believing in the same God. And I'm thinking maybe he was like a future mediation expert, trying to like bring people together and end the conversation. And his comments seemed to quiet the class, and to this day, I don't really know why I blurted it out. Because in that momentary lull of conversation, after the one second grade kid said something about us all believing in that same God, and then the quiet came with heads nodding in agreement, I said, well, I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist. And the room got instantly quiet. I mean, completely quiet. And one kid shot back, you don't really believe in God? Really? That's right. And if there had been crickets at that time of year, that's what you would have heard. And then all of a sudden, the second kid points at me and laughed and slaps his knee, because I had really had them going, an atheist? There's no such thing. Ha, good one, O'Connell. And the whole class burst into laughter. And then, of course, the teacher, Mrs. Crowd, came rushing back in with all the commotion. And can you imagine asking what just happened to a classroom full of 7-year-olds, all trying to speak at the same time? She informed us, after she got everyone to quiet down, that we would no longer be talking about religion, or come to think of it, politics, in her class. And of course, with the attention spans that we had, we immediately went on to something else. And that was that. The other kids just assumed I was this big prankster. And I had briefly and suddenly felt very alone in my class. In a way, I was glad they thought I was just kidding. Now, in second grade, I didn't have the word humanist, but if I did, that would have been more accurate. So I take atheist to mean the belief that gods do not exist, and that it's one form of humanism. A humanism affirms the inherent value and capability of human beings, individually and collectively. Humanism prefers science, critical thinking, and rationalism over supernatural revelation. It's one of the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, and it's been prominent in our congregations for generations. Certainly that's how I grew up. Humanist teachings counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Humanist ideas began to flourish with the Enlightenment, that elite cultural movement of 18th century European intellectuals, and they informed our Declaration of Independence. They informed the Bill of Rights, which were pretty radical at the time they came out. Humanism was a response to the old ideas of a medieval worldview, and it reached back further in time to the ancient Greeks. Ironically, once the Bible began to be printed into books, it meant people who knew how to read could read the Bible on their own. They didn't have to take the word of a priest about it. And they could make up their own minds about what it meant. You could find out things by yourself, and all of a sudden, the world could become a more understandable place and free. Now, in the medieval worldview, and even though it's the medieval worldview, this may sound a little familiar to you, everyone should be subject to external control, both political and religious, both thought and behavior. The idea of freedom as we think about it now was unknown then. The proper attitude for everyone was passive. There was a certain hierarchy, and everyone had their place, from the king to the slave. The really important events happened in the past, and everyone ought to be living with the guilt of being inherently sinful and depraved. This is who you are, how you were born. Don't think about changing anything. Truth was received in ages past. It's unchangeable, and it came from a remote and transcendent God that you could have no relationship with. And if you were to say otherwise out loud, you would not get the disapproving laughter of second graders. No. If you said God was unimportant or didn't exist, in some places you would be put to death. The Renaissance humanist Michael Servetus was burned at the stake in Switzerland in 1553 for his Unitarian beliefs. Just the one God, not the three. Humanism came to take the opposite tack on the traditional Orthodox Christian view. So instead of confirming the inherent sinfulness and depravity of every person. Humanism affirmed the inherent worth and dignity. Not sinfulness and depravity, but the worth and dignity of every person. People do not live in a fallen world, but in a marvelous, endlessly unfolding universe whose secrets are waiting to be unlocked via the human mind and the scientific method. And not only that, but humanism stresses the idea of autonomy, that we each have the right and obligation to decide for ourselves. Well, how much do we get to decide for ourselves? Do we get to decide or discover our sexual orientation? Do we get to decide or discover our gender identity? What? That's autonomy. This is the idea against heteronomy, which is that truth, all truth, especially religious truth, is formed outside of you. And that for your own good, you should submit to being governed by whatever church's teachings you happen to be living in. Now, Unitarian Universalists don't always believe what they're told. Well, what do y'all believe? Because I could talk to Ronnie over here, and he may not have the same beliefs as Jerry over here. Well, how can you even have a congregation if you don't share common beliefs? Well, we do share common beliefs, just not the ones that might immediately jump to your mind. So we don't just believe anything. We go through a process of discernment, and we come to believe what we must. We come to believe what we must that's going to inform our values, that's going to help us live out our faith in the world, that's going to help us say, hey, we got a problem. We got these kids. They don't have coats. They come to school. Other kids make fun of them because they smell bad. We got a problem. I don't have that problem. They have that problem. I don't even know these kids. Well, I don't know them that well. I mean, what is it presumptuous for us to reach out and try and help them? This is what autonomy is all about. It's like, hey, I get to decide. I'm going to see a problem. I'm going to go talk to that person, and I'm going to ask, how can I help? So another way to think about this is the difference between a vertical relationship and a horizontal relationship. So in traditional religion, we've got the horizontal relationship. There's us, there's humans here, and then there's God. Sometimes that God is remote, transcendent, ineffable, immutable. Just there's you, there's God, let thy words be few. Humanism says, well, we're not really going to pay too much attention to that. We are going to pay attention to horizontal, to human relationships. It's not about gods for humanists, but about human progress and relationships. And there's a particular emphasis on science and rationality. So in their book, Humanism is the Next Step, Lloyd and Mary Moraine write, humanists feel at home in the natural world and do not need gods or a god, a heaven, or scriptures. Moreover, they feel that humans do not need the promise of a heaven after death. They do not need the promise of a heaven after death just to be kind to other people, to feel loyalty to the whole human race. Humanism promises a certain assurance that reason eventually, maybe not in our lifetimes, reason will eventually triumph. If humanists are without a dependable fatherly being who will protect them against nature, they realize that in another sense, nature itself is dependable. As we study our environment, it becomes less frightening and more predictable. And as we study and understand and cooperate with nature, we flourish. Ours is the assurance that no event, no experience is necessarily beyond reason. There is a basic sort of order and explanation if we could but find it, they write. Humanists feel that religion, ethics, and religious feeling do not require God. That doesn't mean that humanists, some at least, don't find religious awe and wonder. As Reverend Kendall Gibbons, a friend of mine and a UU minister humanist, puts it, God is one name we give to a way of trying to describe a certain experience. This is an experience that comes when we are somehow mysteriously filled. When we get past our distractions and illusions and pride to the reality upon which existence itself is founded. So I think religious humanists recognize a larger reality. They choose not to name God. That can be very liberating. And we know the dangers. I'm pretty sure most of us in this room know the dangers of religious fundamentalism. So here's a question I bet you've never asked yourself. Are there dangers to fundamentalism when it comes to humanism? Is there like a fundamentalist humanism? And if so, is that something we should be paying attention to? All right, so let's consider this. You've heard the word orthodoxy, and that means right belief, which means it's correct belief. And if it's not the correct belief, then it's the wrong belief, right? Really handy. Really handy. It's either dark or it's not. So it's often easy for us to recognize right-wing orthodoxy, but sometimes we might miss left-wing orthodoxy because it can feel a little close to home, a little close to our beliefs. So there are three dangers I think I've noticed over the last 20 years or so. The first danger is what I would call flat earth humanism. It's the idea that humanism is the end state of religion for everyone. Not only is it the next logical step in Western religious evolution, it is the final step. So the problem is going to be, like, we have those 6 sources, right? Well, humanism is the 5th. We have you Christians, we got you Buddhists, we're on you humanists now. That's the end of the story for some people. We don't need anything else. But then the 6th source came in 20, 30 years ago, whenever it was, and people were saying, well, no. Earth-based religions is part of our beliefs, and here's why. So this gets tricky for some people because they have arrived at what they feel is the end of their spiritual journey. And for them, that might be, it's like, it's like when you're shopping for a house or an apartment to rent, and you finally find the one, you don't really need to keep looking. And, well, if I'm a humanist, then anybody who's a regular, normal thinker is going to eventually arrive at the same thing. So why are people keeping going? No, it's over here. We don't need to go over there. So that's flat earth humanism. The truth is, we're not going to say this out loud, but the truth is those who remain wedded to some of those old religions are in some manner poor suckers who are still stuck with superstition. This leads to an intolerant view of anything non-humanist, and in turn can become a new fundamentalism. This is an easy trap to fall into. If you escaped a religious fundamentalism and you arrive through these 6 sources and you find humanism and say, this is it, it could be easy to turn that into a new orthodoxy. And then one day, let's say you grew up fundamentalist. And then one day you come to realize, you go to college, you find out not everybody's dad drinks a 6-pack of beer every night. Really? What else do I not know about how to live and how other people live? One day you come to realize the earth probably wasn't made in 6 days. Maybe these are Bible stories, and maybe these stories are literature. Maybe they have a truth that's important to pay attention to, but maybe they're not actually a set of facts. And so you become a humanist. So we want to avoid a triumphalist viewpoint, one that says that one day we'll all be a certain brand of Christians or a certain brand of humanists, because, why? Because we actually value diversity. So that means not everyone in this room is going to believe the same thing about the same things that I do. And that's a good thing. It can feel a little scary sometimes, but it's a good thing. Having a lot of different beliefs in our congregation helps our own free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Another reason is that we believe revelation is not sealed. We will continue to learn new things that can change our beliefs. The second danger about humanism is it can end up becoming scientism, which means you use science as your religion and only see things through a scientific lens. And if you see everything and only through a scientific lens, you are going to miss out on quite a lot. Science doesn't have a lot of really interesting things to say about music, literature, art, drama, and poetry. As Michael Werner put it in the Humanist magazine, Barber's Adagio for strings can musically send us into the depths of sorrow. You've heard music, maybe instrumental music, which just reached in and squeezed your heart. It moved you emotionally. Shakespeare tells us more about human character than most psychological science, and Greek sculpture reflects the highest visions of the human form. So, while science, philosophy, and logic are really important, humanism also involves the arts and the emotions. We're not fully human unless we can feel our emotions. The third danger of sort of a fundamentalist humanism is mistaking human beings as God. I mean, this is easy to do because, after all, humans used to be the product of evolution. Now humans are directing evolution. How godlike can you get? We can be easy and comfortable, even complacent about our humanist viewpoint, so it's important to remember the danger is we will say, you know what, revelation is sealed, we don't need to go any further. This is the only reasonable view. Prove me wrong. That's not welcoming diversity. This is my belief, prove me wrong. That's what fundamentalists do. We want to avoid that. The second danger is making science into God, and then the third one is making ourselves God. So, I grew up in a largely UU congregation. My mother was the choir director for a while, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized how unusual my upbringing had been. Some of the things that I grew up with as a UU kid, our kids are still growing up with today. Number one, you don't have to believe in a particular version of God to be a religious person. You don't have to believe in a particular version of God to be a religious person. 2, and if you ever want a 3-word definition of the fifth source, humanism, here it is. Deeds, not creeds. Deeds are more important than creeds. Your actions speak louder than your words. And it's important to make the world a better place. There are so many ways to make a difference. We heard a few people up here, it was like 50, right? And we've also heard Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, people will come up, it'll be an announcement, it'll be a joy, it'll be a concern. Here's an opportunity to do something for yourself by making the world just a little bit better for just a little while. Our beliefs change with ongoing revelation. As you could start out as an atheist, as I did, but then I didn't stay an atheist. You could start out as a theist. You can change from one set of beliefs to another. We don't believe whatever we want. We believe what we must. Unitarian Universalists articulate beliefs through a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And of course, there are different paths. Do humanists go to church? Well, some of you are here, so I guess yes. And there's not just one branch of humanism. There's Christian humanists, religious humanists, mystic humanists, secular humanists. The common denominator is that we have relationships with each other. We get up, we get cleaned up, we have something to eat, we show up here, we have relationships. Despite our different beliefs about different things, you can be a good UU whether you're a humanist or not. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. May we continue to honor the points of view that stretch our minds, that challenge our assumptions, and that deepen our relationships with each other on this journey. So may it be. Amen.